Hello everyone and welcome to this Antares-internal introduction video to the second prototype of the primitive Desert Tortoise. Ship I've cut before me is a result of several months of development between Silent Swift and me primarily, with some help by Kelmore, in our attempt to develop and produce a working and semi-reliable moon surface miner built as a scraper. You can clearly see that this is supposed to be a scraper configuration. That does not mean that Antares has taken a strong position in the whole scraper versus driller debate. It's just that this is what we have right now. In our last field test done yesterday, the primitive Desert Tortoise prototype has shown some promising results after some very disastrous earlier attempts. And as such, we believe it is time to open this up to more general testing by all company members. And to prepare for that, I'm making this introduction video. The primitive Desert Tortoise prototype should be stationed at Crystal Palace moon base on the Elysium moon. Right now, as you can see, this is not the Elysium moon, this is Spot, the submoon of Elster, but we will be bringing it back to Elysium soon. Access is granted to all company members. You can just go to Crystal Palace and spawn it if you would like. Those company members who have been with the company for a while will probably recognize the design already. This is clearly based on the Tortoise B belt miner, but it has seen major reworks on the inside. Few parts you have probably already noticed is the normal, usual forward-facing lasers, and all connectors are missing. The weapons are missing. And of course there are now 20 mining lasers pointing downwards. And also 6 ore connectors. These mining lasers are mounted on turntables, and during operation the turntables will swing slowly from one side to another by about 20 degrees. Before you go out and mine with the Desert Tortoise prototype, it is recommended that you spawn it, move it just inside the safe zone somewhere, and then familiarize yourself with its controls and its features, so that you won't find any surprises while out there mining. As we enter the Desert Tortoise from the rear, we can already see some of those modifications. Most obvious one is we now have a whole lot more generator fuel chambers. This ship now has 47 fuel chambers. We have some different controls. Most of the large propellant tanks have been removed and replaced with even more generators. The ship is not a long-distance belt miner anymore, so it doesn't need all that propellant, but it does need huge amounts of power to power those 20 lasers. Also, clearly visible are those generator enhancers. As we can see in this part where the crafting benches used to be, we now have some more batteries to buffer all that electricity use. And of course, the scripts have also largely changed. In the cockpit, you can still see the old two-person cockpit design with one pilot and one mining operator. During early testing phases, one of the recurring problems that we had was energy just running out to the point that not even the generator script would work anymore. For that reason, we now have this generator lever here in the cockpit, and if things go wrong, if not even the generator script works anymore, you can just grab it, crank it up to maximum, and then soon after you will have power again. Of course, now that the generator script is running, it will immediately reset it back to 0 if no power is actually needed. Generator script is the one standard script that you find on most recent Antares designs, and it also has all the controls you're used to from other Antares designs. Those controls include a gen off and a force gen button and a warm-up button. As per the usual for Antares ships, the gen off button and the force gen button are only supposed to be used for unusual situations. They are not supposed to be used for normal everyday operations. The thing with the force gen button is people tend to forget about it once they enable it, and that had a tendency in the past to lead to depleted fuel rods in the most unopportune situations. So try not to use the force gen button unless you absolutely have to. And of course gen off is similar. People tend to forget about it and then be surprised why they don't have any power. First we will look at the new hover mode. This ship is supposed to operate very close to the surface and very slowly move forwards following the terrain. To that end we have added a hover mode, which in this version of the prototype combines hover and level functions. All the hover and level functions, as you can already see from those nodes in the cockpits, are controlled by the rangefinders you see on the outside of the ships. There are 5 rangefinders on the ship. 1 directly below the cockpit under the nose, and then 4 on all of the engine pods on the outsides. These rangefinders will tell us how far we are from the ground and whether we are pitched or rolled. As you can see, we also have a gyroscope, but that is at this point purely informational, and the pitch and roll control will not use it. They will use just rangefinders. In the futures, we might add switch between gyroscope usage and rangefinder usage, because during field tests with this prototype it turned out that purely terrain following level is not always the best idea. Sometimes you would like the more static gyroscope based approach back. As for how this works, you can already see some of the values used here and here. What you can see here are the distances currently measured by the various rangefinders. Those here right now are old values because their rangefinders are off. And these are some values calculated from that and then used later in the hover and level mode. If you want to just see what the rangefinders are doing without enabling hover, you can press this button that enables the rangefinders without enabling hover mode. If you just press hover mode, the rangefinders will also be enabled, and they will be disabled again when you disable hover mode. But outside of that, you can just enable the rangefinders with this button and then see what they do. You can see we are at 43 meters roundabout from the ground right now. Apparently the back left rangefinder has found some slightly higher ground than the others. Our low point is exactly that back left rangefinder. The low point calculates always the least distance of any of the 4 corner rangefinders from the ground. Then we have measured pitch and measured roll. That just looks at the difference between the front and the back rangefinders for pitch and the difference between the left and right rangefinders for roll. 2 more displays here, vertical speed and target vertical speed. Vertical speed is what it says. If you move up and down, you will see the vertical speed changing. This is all just measured using the rangefinders. So if the rangefinders don't touch the ground, the vertical speed will not tell you anything. Target V-speed is calculated by a different ULOT script. It is dependent on the hover height the user configures in this lever right here. And it is the speed that the ship thinks it should be going in order to reach that hover height. Care has to be taken when enabling hover. You have to first look at this lever. We do not have a failsafe yet for that. As you can see, the hover height, after you newly spawn the ship, is at 0 by default. But if you enable hover now, it will try to get to a height of 0 and crash into the ground, which isn't a problem in the safe zone, but outside of the safe zone that it will be. So let us now try the hover mode. I will set it to a more sane value, like say 20 meters. Since we are now at 40 something meters, we're clearly higher than it. And I will just press the hover button and see what happens. As you can see, the ship starts sinking. Slowly, very slowly. It is intentionally very slow. Because if it were faster, it might easily overshoot the target and then either crash into the ground or disappear into space. Overshooting the target is still a bit of a problem, even in the current prototype, so have a bit of patience. It may move up or down quite a bit before it actually reaches its desired height. This effect will get worse as you get closer to the ground, because at that point the game engines built in hover mode will also play a role and will make things a lot more complicated for the ship's hover mode. That said, if you do have a bit of patience, it will settle somewhere between the configured hover height and 3 meters above the configured hover height. Let's have a bit of patience and see if this happens. It tends to overshoot it above, which is better than below, I suppose. Okay, by now it has reached roughly the desired height. It still keeps correcting constantly, and it will keep correcting constantly, or as long as you have hover mode enabled, because ship just won't stand still. It just doesn't happen. Right. Next thing to consider will be the actual mining operations. Mining operation for the lasers is enabled, you guessed it, with the lasers button. Collectors are enabled separately. If you just enable the lasers but not the collectors, the lasers will destroy the ores they find, but they won't be picked up. So also press the collect ore button. One thing you have to consider is that you still have to configure the length of the laser beams and the strength of the collectors. If you don't do anything here, you won't notice any results, or the lasers will seem to stay off. If you press the lasers button right now, nothing much will happen, because the ship has a failsafe and will not start the mining script while the generator unit rate is still below 58. How do you get it above 58 in the first place? You press the Warmup button. The Warmup button is our stand-in for the fourth gen button. Some of you probably already know the Warmup button from the Phoenicia class. In the Phoenicia class, it is used and necessary to use for traveling. That is not necessary in the Desert Tortoise. In the Desert Tortoise, it is only useful to enable mining. Because, same as in the Phoenicia, if you were not to enable it and start, the batteries would run out before the generators have started up sufficiently. And then we'd run out of power, and that, when running mining lasers, tends to be a big problem. It can lead to damage. For now, I have still left the mining laser beam length off, left it to 0. We'll wait now until the generator unit rate has come up to 58. And then we will enable the lasers, and we can hear something. With the lasers disabled, we can just go out and see what the turntables are doing. What you can see here is what's going to happen while mining, only with lasers, of course. Once we configure a reasonable laser beam length, then actual lasers will, of course, come out. Yeah. I've noticed earlier that the 4th gen button has a problem of people just forgetting about it and then running out of fuel later. The warm-up button is on a timer because of that. So it is more or less fire and forget button. You press it, you start mining. Power draw from mining will keep the generators running, but the warm-up button will go off after a while. After this timer here reaches 0, the warm-up button will go off. So we cannot forget about it. Another thing we have configured is a forward crawl mode to be enabled with the F crawl button. That too needs to be configured first using a lever. What it does is make infrequent, or rather periodical, but periodical pulses of forward speed with, I think, about half a minute or more of pause between them. So the ship will stay in one place for quite a while and then move only very slowly. Now enable F crawl, setting of about 1.4 for the pull strength has worked out well for us so far, but you can experiment with it a bit. We enable it and then watch the ship from the outside. For a while, we will be able to see that it is slowly moving forward. It would seem to be moving forward extremely, almost ridiculously slowly. But, as we figured out while surface mining in our tests, if the ship is moving so slowly that you have to do a double take to notice that it's moving at all, that is right about the correct speed for surface mining. You don't want to be going any faster than that. Right. With all that said, let's move out of the safe zone and look at what the actual mining process looks like. Disable F crawl so we can move normally again. One more thing to consider is before you head out of the safe zone, you should make double sure that the person who is piloting the ship actually has hosting of the ship. This is of course important and a good idea in pretty much all ships, but in moon scrapers that operate very close to the surface and operate powerful lasers near the surface, it is even more important. Our typical failure mode during testing of earlier prototypes was running into Starbase game bugs that would turn around the turret that the lasers are rotated by 180 degrees and make the lasers come into the cabin and hit, for example, the batteries or the propellant tanks and make the ship explode. We have now included some fail safes that should avoid that. But if there's a sudden disconnect, problems might still happen. A sudden disconnect of the hosting person, that is. So we will now put everything together here. We'll first enable Warmup because that takes a while to actually reach steady generator state. We will enable hover mode and set it to a much lower height, like 6 meters. We will enable our lasers. Need to be at maximum, but the collectors really should be at maximum. And we will enable F crawl. Now once the generators are up, they are up now, we will enable collectors and lasers. As you can see, game performance immediately drops dramatically. Also at this point it could be a good idea to connect to the ship's internal resource switch. Let me just adjust the audio a bit so you can still hear me. That should be better. While in operation, we recommend to only leave the ship during the rear door, via the rear doors, because on the front doors there is this backward thruster that you might run into. That is something we would like to avoid. And grab cut here, the mining mode is broken again. Right, back again after a cut, because the mining mode was broken again and the turrets weren't moving and I had to fix that again. But we're back now and we can now watch the actual real mining process in action. See, at the moment everything is happening exactly as it's supposed to be. Of course, word of caution, when you're out there actually mining, be careful around the ship, especially outside of the safe zone. Careful about those thrust exhausts. Be careful about those lasers. They can kill you, absolutely. And do try not to run below the rangefinder lasers, because if you do, it will upset hover and level mode. Now those lasers aren't dangerous, but you will upset the ship if you do that. You can now just watch the miner mode do its thing. As you can see, the ship is still constantly hovering up and down. So be a bit more conservative about how low exactly you set your hover mode, or your hover height rather. Because if you set it a bit too low, then it might occasionally crash into the ground, which will break things. Now that the mining is going on, we can look at the cargo, and we can see there has been stuff coming in already. Right now some cherodium is coming in, some deltium. So things are working fine. And you can see it is very, very slowly moving forwards. At this low speed, the ship will eventually dig a very deep trench and fairly narrow trench. Sometimes, with this prototype, it still happens that the rangefinders on the sides will slip into the actual trench we just dug. Unfortunately, that tends to be a problem. You may need to correct this from inside the cockpit when it happens, because at that point the ship will roll to that side of the rangefinder that went into the hole and keep going even further into the hole, and that will not make for a good time. Later prototypes, we hope, will have the rangefinders on some wider outriggers, so they won't so easily go into the trench we just dug. Also, as I mentioned much earlier, we are planning to do a secondary level mode that will again, as it used to before, use the gyroscope, and in that case the range features will be ignored. That is something you have to keep in mind, of course. On Spud it might actually be a more useful variant to use a gyroscope based hover, but Spud is a very, very flat moon with very large flat surfaces. Most other moons have rolling hills, and on those moons you will probably want to use terrain following instead, because the terrain is not trivial. And yeah, as you can see, sometimes turrets, especially if the ship does weird things with its maneuvering, are still having problems moving fast enough. But that doesn't really hurt the mining process. Okay, I hope that was enough information to allow you to try the prototype out a couple of times. If you do that, it would be very nice if you could make notes or even run a screen recording software so we can actually look at what's happening out afterwards and diagnose it and yeah, draw some conclusions from it. For now, that was it. Yeah, have fun with our prototype.